Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Parenti, and he is a social scientist, lecturer, and author of several books, including Democracy for the Few, The Sword and the Dollar, and Inventing Reality. And the most recent work, which is being published this August, is Land of Idols, Political Mythology in America. Please welcome Dr. Parenti.
Thank you. I'm a relative novice in the assassination area, not in conspiracies, but in assassination. When I was telling someone I was coming here to speak, he said, "Oh, you're becoming one of the assassination buffs." And I thought I would reject that term. I didn't really like it, assassination buff, because it trivializes the issue. It reduces our very real concern about justice, about crime in government, about gangsterism in the executive. It reduces it to a kind of a hobby or a quaint enthusiasm. I mean, you wouldn't talk about Holocaust buffs, would you? I'm a Holocaust buff. I just like to read about concentration camps and investigate them and all that. We are very serious investigators. We're serious investigators in a political struggle about the very nature of the national security state and about the very nature of our government and democracy. And the establishment people portray us otherwise. What is disturbing is that there are some people on the left who also do likewise, who march hand in hand with the establishment apologists. On the JFK assassination, they stand shoulder to shoulder with their enemies on the right. And Peter Dale Scott pointed out to me last summer that, in fact, certain left and liberal publications like The Nation, The Progressive, and a number of others have not in 30 years published a single article about the assassination, not a single critical investigation. What they have, though, since in abundance, is published all sorts of things by some of their own writers showing their utter ignorance of the issue and their kind of intellectual superiority. The same goes for Z Magazine. Noam Chomsky pointing out patronizingly that there is in this country a Kennedy revival, a Camelot revival, a Camelot yearning. The yearning for a lost Messiah, these are all different quotes. The grieving for a leader destroyed by dark and mysterious forces. We heard Gary Willis quoted by Mr. Kaiser, I think it was yesterday, or maybe, I don't remember, yeah, yesterday, who said, people must accept planned evil. They cannot accept the idea that there's random evil. Well, we know there's random evil, but we also know there's planned evil. But there's this patronizing psychologizing that's been coming from some liberal and from more than liberal left people who sound just like the conservatives, who sound just like the right-wingers, who sound just like the New York Times proponents. The psychocultural pronouncements about why you people have these yearnings and you're lost and that's why you're doing these things, whereas we are above those kinds of feelings. Well, I see no evidence of a Kennedy revival. I see no popular glorification or nostalgia for Camelot. Certainly no millenarian longing for the lost Messiah. If there was a mass Kennedy revival, it happened on a weekend that I was out of town. But Alexander Cockburn, Noam Chomsky, Michael Albert, Christopher Phelps, former editor of the now defunct Guardian, and others, challenged the notion that Kennedy was assassinated for intending to withdraw from Vietnam, undo the CIA, end the Cold War. These things could not have led to his downfall because they weren't true, they assert. Kennedy was a cold warrior and a counterinsurgent, and by the way, I think he was those things, who wanted a military withdrawal from Vietnam only with victory. But that's not the whole picture. The left critics claim that the change of administration came with John F. Kennedy's assassination. The change that came had no large-scale effect on policy, not even on tactics. That is an argument made by Cockburn. That is an argument made by Noam Chomsky. In other words, if Kennedy had lived, he probably would have fabricated a Tonkin Gulf-type casus belli, introduced U.S. ground troops in a massive way, carpet-bombed Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam as Richard Nixon did. He would have risked destroying his own electoral base. He would have proved himself a mass murderer as bad as Nixon. Now, Chomsky and Cockburn and others do not tell us by what extrasensory perception they come to this conclusion. The evidence we do have is that Kennedy observed Cambodian neutrality, that he negotiated a ceasefire and coalition government in Laos, which the CIA refused to honor, preferring to back a right-wing military faction that continued the war. We also know that Kennedy, in 1963, and Roger Hilsman points this out, was the only person in his own administration who opposed the introduction of U.S. ground troops. The only other evidence of what Kennedy might have done is with the surviving Kennedy. Robert Kennedy went on to break with the Johnson administration and the war policy and become a peace senator, a dove in the Senate, and then moved to become a peace candidate for president. It's not saying that John F. Kennedy would have taken the same course, but why would John and Robert were very close, by the way, in their thinking, whatever else. They might have responded to many of the same developments and pressures. We don't know, but it does give us pause. In 1963, people in right-wing circles were saying it was an open secret in this country that delinquent in the White House has to be dealt with. Just about 2 months ago, station KGO in San Francisco, I was listening to a late-night show. Michael Krasny was interviewing. A call-in comes in from some guy who says, I was an intelligence officer, military intelligence in Japan in 1963. This is the first time I've ever said anything about this. And I'm saying it now. But we all knew that he was going to be killed. Everybody talked about when Kennedy was going to be blown away because he was messing with the intelligence community. And I remember that night when he was shot. When word came of his death, this guy went on. He said he recalls hearing delighted comments like, "We got the bastard." What John Kennedy's enemies saw is something rather different from what Coburn and Chomsky now insist that we should see. They saw a Kennedy who refused to provide air coverage at the Bay of Pigs, his unwillingness to launch another invasion of Cuba, his no invasion guarantee given to Khrushchev on Cuba, his atmospheric test ban treaty with Moscow, his American University speech calling for a re-examination of our Cold War attitudes toward the Soviet Union, his unwillingness to send ground troops into Vietnam, his antitrust suit against General Electric, the most reactionary of all corporations, his fight with U.S. Steel over price increases, his challenge to the Federal Reserve Board, his warm reception at labor conventions, his call, albeit grudgingly and reluctantly, but his call for racial equality and responsiveness to civil rights leaders, and his talk of moving forward in a new frontier and all that. Why is the JFK assassination of such importance? First, we might ask, why is it not? Alexander Coburn argues in The Nation that whether Kennedy died from a bullet or from breaking his neck tripping over one of Caroline's dolls is a matter of no importance. Kennedy was a faithful representative of the powers that be. Well, if all the things I just listed were not enough for us on the left, they were much too much for those on the right. But Coburn says no. He was a faithful power. Nothing changed with his death. Then, contradicting himself, Coburn then argues in the next issue of The Nation that how JFK died is an important question, and he gives his entire column, which overflowed onto a third page, to a Warren Commission hack who presented arguments about the magic bullet and how Oswald did it as a single gun and all that. Arguments that could only be embraced by someone who was thoroughly ignorant of the huge body of hard evidence pointing to a conspiracy. So Coburn stands with Tom Wicker and Daniel Shore and George Will and William Buckley and the entire capitalist mainstream media as a defender of the Warren Commission, bringing debate on the left to a new low. And by the way, Chomsky and Coburn and a number of others have pointed out the passion of these assassination buffs, how impassioned they are about it. Meanwhile, the passion that they've been, none of us have been putting out as much articles in time as they have in refuting the passionate, committed people. Listen to the dispassionate Alexander Coburn on Oliver Stone's movie, JFK. He criticizes the movie, quote, for its truly fascist yearning for the father leader and its, quote, fascist aesthetics. Those who oppose Coburn's view in an exchange of articles are, quote, fraudulent, these are different quotes, fraudulent, flatulent, silly, foolish, conspiracy mongering. I gleaned these from a whole bunch of different responses he made. Guilty of pure bunkum, that was me, filled with hot air from start to finish, needing to be, quote, confined to a lunatic asylum, suffering from demented optic and fascist mentality, he called the respected radical scholar Philip Green, quote, a popcorn machine of self-regarding blather. He called Jim Garrison, quote, a berserk self-publicist. And those were not the worst of his drive-by shootings, as Peter calls them, Coburn's drive-by shootings. Erwin Knoll, editor of The Progressive, joined the fray as nastily as any right-winger, writing, quote, I don't question Stone's right to turn a buck by pandering to the emotions of a gullible audience. By the way, that's you he's talking about. That's us he's talking about. And see, they're not gullible. They're smart and sophisticated and all that. But I insist on my right to despise him for doing so. He despises Stone. So along with imputing only the crassest motives to Oliver Stone's cinematic efforts and political commitment, Knoll conjures up a patronizing image of the gullible public. By the way, that's also a favorite theme of Coburn's and Noam Chomsky's, that it's a gullible public. And in response to people who said that 3/4 of the American people believe there was a conspiracy, they say 3/4 of the American people also believe in miracles, that there are polls showing that. And it's a facile argument. What they are doing is equating the gullibility about miracles with the public's refusal to be gullible about the official version, the crap that's been handed down to them by the Warren Commission. And those aren't two things to be equated. Like Coburn and Chomsky and others, Erwin Knoll doesn't know a goddamn thing about the Kennedy assassination. He hasn't read a thing about it. And I know this because we write in our rebuttals, you don't know a thing about it. They never answer that. They never say, I do so. They always ignore. We repeatedly write, these people who don't know a thing about the assassination and haven't done any critical research, they never respond to that point. He admits he has, quote, I'm going Knoll on Knoll, Erwin Knoll on Erwin Knoll, quote, he has no idea, I have no idea who killed Kennedy. But that doesn't keep him from asserting that the film audiences were manipulated and that Stone provided, quote, false answers. Now wait a minute. If you don't know anything about the assassination, how do you know that this movie provided false answers? Every major investigation, it compiled 26 volumes of testimony and evidence, and far from being hasty and slipshod, it painstakingly crafted theories that moved toward its foreordained conclusion that Oswald was the assassin. It deftly fashioned conclusions out of thin air. It omitted abundant evidence and testimony about gunfire on the grassy knoll. It failed to call witnesses who saw something different from what it wanted to see, and it ignored and reinterpreted what little conflicting evidence that did creep into the proceedings. All of that took very deliberate effort, nothing hasty and slipshod. A hasty, slipshod investigation would show traces of randomness in its errors, but the Commission's distortions consistently moved in the same direction in pursuit of a prefigured hypothesis. It ignored the other conspiracy also, let's point out. It ignored the much greater conspiracy than the JFK murder, which is the conspiracy of the JFK cover-up. The enormous evidence of that, the destruction of John Kennedy's clothing. Who ever heard of a murder where you take the murder victim's clothing and you burn them the next day? The carving out of the limousine interior and getting rid of that and restructuring the limousine. Here was a whole wealth of evidence right in that limousine of blood spots, bullet holes, God knows what, and all that. And it can go on and on. I mean, the cover-up began not long after the shots rang out. In fact, the cover-up was being set up itself before the assassination itself. The Warren Commission had nothing to say about it because it was part of that cover-up, of course. Coburn and Chomsky and Albert of Z Magazine say we must not reduce great developments in history to conspiracy, for then we lose sight of institution, class, and other systemic factors, the larger factors of American capitalism that really determine what's happening. That's a structuralist position, you might say. But a structuralist position, I'm a structuralist, I mean, I do class analysis, I do institutional analysis all the time. A structuralist position should not discount the role of human agency in history. Institutions are not abstract, mystical, self-generating forces. They exist only through conscious human agency. Coburn's phrase, the great continuities in corporate and class interest that kind of just move along and grind themselves out. They do not happen of their own accord. Neither empires nor national security institutions come into existence in a fit of absent-mindedness. They are created by willfully intended policymakers who pursue specific interests. It is the essence of the state and the function of state institutions to act as conscious agents in the recreation of political economic hegemony. And to achieve their goals, state leaders will act openly, legitimatingly, with propaganda, with images, with popular acceptance, and they will also act secretly and quietly. In fact, they got a name for it. They call it covert action, they call it special operations, they call it national security. They say there are all sorts of things we are always doing that you cannot know about. In fact, there's a constant interplay between those two things. And by the way, except for a few Marxist publications, it's ironic, you can't read a structural analysis in The Nation, in The Progressive. What the hell, when do you ever read any such thing about the larger institutional developments through history? What you read about are issues, personalities, events, secret deals, conspiracies, and the like. If JFK was not a progressive, then why is it so important to expose the conspiracy to assassinate him if you're a progressive? See, the idea is if these mafioso guys, if these thugs are killing each other off, why should we be so exercised over it? The propagandists of the right and the center, the mainstream media know why. Tom Wicker of the New York Times, who never wrote a book review in his life, a movie review in his life. He never wrote a movie review in his life until JFK was coming out. 6 months before that, it's the only movie, and I've written a book on movies in Hollywood and entertainment, the politics of Hollywood, make-believe media. And I never found an example of this. This is the first movie in the history of cinematography which was being attacked 6 months before it ever came out. Tom Wicker, who's never written a movie review in his life, now writes a movie review. The average movie review is 800 words. This review is over 2,000 words. It takes up a whole half a page with pictures and all that. And he writes and he tells us, he says what it's all about, why they attacked it so relentlessly. That if the, quote, wild assertions in JFK, the movie, are taken at face value, Americans will have to accept the idea that most of the nation's major institutions conspired together and carried out Kennedy's murder. In an era when mistrust of government and loss of confidence in institutions, the press not the least, are widespread and virulent, such a suggestion seems a dubious public service, unquote. And then Wicker goes on to argue, exactly as does Chomsky, Coburn, and Albert, and Phelps, that Kennedy was not an emerging dove on Vietnam and the Cold War, and therefore the CIA would not have wanted to kill him, that Kennedy got along very well with the CIA. Tell that to Alan Dulles. But Tom Wicker understands the heart of the matter. A full revelation about the murder would be a serious attack upon the legitimacy of the dominant institutions of state and class, the very system that New York Times writers faithfully defend. Playing before mass audiences, a movie like JFK fingered the national security state itself as the murderer. By the way, that had a tremendous effect on people. I know all sorts of people, colleagues of mine are talking about students, who were shaken and rattled and radicalized by this, who were saying, what kind of a government what kind of a society do we live in? By the way, that's the question a lot of us have been trying to get our college students to ask themselves, what kind of a society do we live in? To critically entertain some notions about that, to come out of their somnambulism and look at what that is. And that movie did that. The left critics mistaken the low political value of the victim, JFK. They don't see that particular individual having great political value. They mistaken that with the high political importance and potential of the issue and its implications for democracy. You don't have to love John Kennedy to hate the assassination and see the kind of danger it is to democracy. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, I'm really tired. Captain Dreyfus was really a stiff military conservative. In fact, Clemenceau said about Dreyfus, he said if his name hadn't been Dreyfus, he would have been an anti-Dreyfusard. And yet all sorts of people like Clemenceau, Emile Zola, and others backed up and fought, because the issue of Dreyfus, whether he was guilty or not guilty, l'affaire Dreyfus back in the 1890s, was an issue that transcended the personality of Dreyfus himself. It was an issue that involved the role of the army and the fate of the French Republic itself. Benigno Aquino was a member of the privileged class in the Philippines. He promised no great structural changes, but are you saying we should not be concerned about his murder? The Filipino people should not have seized that as an issue, which shook the whole Marcos regime and brought down the Marcos dictatorship? Romero, Archbishop Romero, who was assassinated in El Salvador. Romero was a member of the Salvadoran elite class. He couldn't become archbishop if he hadn't been. I mean, and what does it matter when murder, when so many tens of thousands of other people are being executed? But it was an important political issue, and most definitely it became an instrument by which to expose people. Let me conclude with just one other thing I wanted to mention. I said I haven't done any original research in assassinations as such. In fact, I want to qualify that. I've just done a study on what I think was an assassination of an American president. He died in 1850. His name was Zachary Taylor. And as you know, in 1991, they opened up his tomb to do an autopsy on Zachary Taylor, and they came forth and said, Zachary Taylor died of natural causes. Well, I looked at the reports, and I found that that the reports say that Taylor had anywhere from 5 to 15 times more arsenic in him than the normal amount in a person living in today's chemicalized environment. That he had something like 50 to 60 times more antimony in him. Antimony is a heavy metal element which is used as a poison, was used in the 19th century as a poison. It's even more toxic than arsenic. And a number of other things, I won't go into it. When Taylor died, Willard Fillmore became president, and Taylor's hardline policy against extensionism of slavery into the Western territories was totally reversed. Willard Fillmore was a friend of Henry Clay's and the Southern oligarchs, and the policy was reversed. The fugitive slave law was reversed. It's a rather remarkable set of reversals that took place. Well, at the time of the 1991 opening of the investigation, historian Eugene Genovese was asked, would any political protagonist in the United States be capable of such a deed? Because we hear this, who would be capable of such deeds? This is America. And Genovese said that while granting that the political circumstances of the era suggest that an assassin would very likely be a pro-slavery Southerner, he said, quote, I can't imagine any Southern personalities who would have been involved in such a conspiracy. Now, you know, when you say that, you're also saying something about yourself. That I, a man of moderation and balance, cannot imagine such a crazy thing being done by these reputable people. See, if you can't imagine such crazy things, what does that say about you, right? You're sort of not as balanced. And then he goes on and he says, but there's always the possibility that there was some nuts who had access to him and did it. Well, what I want to say is history shows us that nuts are not the only ones capable of evil deeds. That gentlemen of principle and power, of genteel manner, can arrive at grim decisions. Yale, Harvard, Princeton graduates even. That if they commit crimes, it's not because they harbor murky and perverse impulses, but because they feel compelled to deal with the dangers posed to their way of life or to their particular interests. It doesn't mean they're motivated merely by personal pocketbook concerns. They often equate their vital interest with the well-being of their society and nation. In fact, the more it affects their vital interest, the more they're convinced it's a general interest for everybody, too. In this case, it would be the interest of the cause for Southern rights. Far from being immoral or unscrupulous, they are individuals of principles that are so lofty as to place them above the normal restraints of morality, you see. They don't act on sudden impulse. The feeling grows among them that something has to be done, this person has to be dealt with, something that will be best for all. The change is gradual, yet it's so compelling that when they arrive at their decision, they're no longer shocked by the extreme measures they're willing to employ. In fact, those extreme measures are now institutionalized in all sorts of death squad programs and whatever else, and with rationales. The execution of the unsavory deeds is made all the easier by delegating the commission to lower level operatives. Ladies and gentlemen, most of the evil in history is perpetrated not by lunatics or monsters or lone psychotics, but by persons of responsibility and commitment whose most unsettling aspect is the apparent normality of their deportment. And those of us who resist this, who are concerned about this and want to expose this, are not suffering from infantile Messiah or Camelot yearnings. We are angry about the politics involved here. We're angry about the gangster nature of these operations, and that anger, that expression, that mobilization, that's not Camelot yearnings, that's not regression, that's not assassination. But the correct name for that process of struggle is called democracy, and let's have more of it. Thank you.